Welcome to the Criminal Imagination. This series, Crime and Civilization, begins with a simple question. What if the true purpose of law is not justice but control? Across centuries, crime fiction has recorded the political fears of its age, from cursed kings and cunning thieves to corrupt judges and silent witnesses. Each episode investigates how power operates through narrative, what it hides, who it condemns, and what happens when the system turns inward and begins to devour itself. There are moments in history when a single name becomes larger than life. Not a king, not a philosopher, but a thief, Jack Sheppard, apprentice, escape artist, criminal, and somehow a national legend. In 1839, William Harrison Ainsworth's Jack Sheppard transformed a real-life 18th-century outlaw into something far more mythic, a romantic hero who defies authority, transcends class, and outwits the prison system that sought to contain him. But what happens when the symbol of class revolt, the trickster, the rogue, the thief, gets absorbed into the machinery of literature and cultural memory? When resistance becomes story and story becomes safety? This is not just the tale of a daring escape artist, it is a study in the deep contradictions between myth and state, emotion and order, freedom and discipline. It's a chapter in the history of how the modern state learned to turn defiance into entertainment and rebellion into nostalgia. Today, we enter the case file of Jack Sheppard as part of our ongoing investigation into how crime fiction reflects the rise and crisis of the modern state. Before we reach Ainsworth, we must understand Jack Sheppard as truly who he was, or at least as what history records him. Born in 1702, Jack Sheppard was a carpenter's apprentice who abandoned his trade for crime. His criminal career was short, intense, and notorious. What made him famous was not just his thefts, but his repeated escapes from the seemingly inescapable Newgate prison. Each escape humiliated the authorities, thrilled the public, and chipped away at the illusion of state control. By the time of his execution in 1724, Sheppard had become a phenomenon. Broadsheets, pamphlets, folk ballads, and stage plays carried his legend forward. His public hanging drew tens of thousands of spectators, a mix of spectacle, grief, and celebration. He became what Michel Foucault would later call the criminal hero, a figure through whom the public dramatized its own frustrations with the punitive apparatus of the state. But it wasn't until the Victorian age, more than a century later, that Sheppard's image was born in literary form, and it was Ainsworth who made that resurrection possible. William Harrison Ainsworth published Jack Sheppard in 1839 at the height of Victorian fascination with crime and urban spectacle. This was the same year Charles Dickens released Oliver Twist, another novel concerned with the criminal underclass and the moral ambiguities of poverty. But where Dickens sought redemption and social critique, Ainsworth embraced melodrama, gothic flair, and hero worship. In Ainsworth's hands, Sheppard becomes something else entirely, not merely a criminal, but a romantic outlaw. What does that mean? To understand this, we must turn to Romanticism, not simply as an artistic movement, but as a philosophical revolt. Romanticism emerged in the late 18th century as a response to Enlightenment, rationalism, industrialization, and the expanding bureaucracies of modern states. Where the Enlightenment prized order, utility, and reason, Romanticism celebrated emotion, spontaneity, nature, and individual genius. The romantic hero was often an exile, a rebel, a sufferer. He stood outside society, sometimes above it and sometimes against it. The figure of the outlaw became a central motif. Byron's Corsair, Schiller's Karl Moor, and now Ainsworth's Jack Sheppard. But this was no longer the real Sheppard, the illiterate boy who stole watches and bundles of linen. This Jack is stylized, charismatic, tragic. His criminality is not vice, it's virtue misunderstood. His escapes are not accidents, they are poetry in motion. His defiance becomes the very measure of his soul. To grasp the significance of this transformation, we must place Jack Sheppard with the broader history of state formation. By the early 19th century, Britain had evolved into a modern bureaucratic state. Courts, police, prisons, and surveillance technologies were formalized and expanded. Jeremy Bentham's concept of the panopticon, an architectural design in which prisoners are always visible to a central eye, epitomized this new rational order. Though the panopticon itself was never fully built, its logic, constant observation, internalized discipline permeated the modern penal system. In this context, Jack Sheppard is not merely a thief. He is a symbolic revolt against a world increasingly organized by rules, files, statistics, and procedures. Each time Sheppard breaks out of Newgate, he doesn't escape a prison, he escapes a world built on rational design. He slips through the cracks of Enlightenment order. He evades the very institutions that claim to make society safe and legible. His triumphs are short-lived, but they matter, not because they last but because they expose the seams of the state's mask. Ainsworth's novels draws heavily on Romantic aesthetics. The setting is dark and gothic, the prose is lush, the emotions are heightened, the moral lines are blurred. This matters because Romanticism was not merely nostalgic, it was subversive. It allowed readers to feel something that the state wanted to suppress: sympathy for the criminal, identification with the outlaw, mourning for the man condemned. To the rational state, crime is a deviation, a number in a ledger, a file on a desk. But to the romantic imagination, crime is story. It is soul. It is an eruption of individuality in a world of conformity. In portraying Sheppard as emotionally vivid and aesthetically compelling, Ainsworth directly challenges the logic of state discipline. He resists the sanitizing gaze of the state paperwork with the messier, more humanizing gaze of the narrative. This is not to say Ainsworth was a revolutionary. He was not. But his novel functions as a cultural artifact in which the state's monopoly on meaning is contested by the power of myth. But here lies the paradox. If Jack Sheppard is a romanticization of resistance, it is also a neutralization of it. Romanticism, for all its beauty, can be politically disarming. By turning Jack into a tragic legend, the novel removes him from the real conditions of poverty, class, violence, and social immobility that produced his criminality. He becomes exceptional rather than systemic. This is the process by which class revolt becomes sanitized. The state no longer needs to suppress Jack, it needs only to retell him. As long as Sheppard remains a story, a charming rogue, a misunderstood genius, he is safe. He becomes part of the cultural tapestry, a museum piece, a costume drama, a figure of nostalgia. In this way, the very institutions he defied can eventually canonize him. Jack becomes literature, the prison becomes heritage, the gallows become history, and the conditions that make Jack Sheppard possible, those remain unchanged. We must not forget that the state did fear Sheppard's legend, especially when it reached the stage. In the early 1840s, following a moral panic about juvenile delinquency, the British government took the extraordinary step of banning all dramatic representations of Jack Sheppard from the stage. The fear was not that his crimes would be repeated, but that his image would inspire. This was a battle not over violence but over meaning. The modern state, as it emerged in the 19th century, sought not only to punish crime but to control how crime was interpreted. It wasn't enough to hang Sheppard, his memory had to be regulated. His story had to be either silenced or tamed. The prohibition of Jack Sheppard from the stage tells us something fundamental: that narrative is power. And when the people begin to love the wrong narrative, when they cheer for the escape instead of the jailer, the state must respond. In this sense, Ainsworth's novel stands at a threshold. It both resists and participates in this act of containment. It mythologizes Jack, but also limits him to the page. It romanticizes a rebellion, but places it safely in the past. The figure of Jack Sheppard did not die with Ainsworth's novel. He became a blueprint. The trope of the noble thief, the gentleman criminal, the anti-hero, the charismatic outlaw, he would appear in countless forms: Raffles, Lupin, Robin Hood retellings, even noir detectives and heist protagonists in 20th century cinema. Each one owes something to Sheppard's transformation from a condemned boy to a literary icon. But with each retelling, the political stakes diminish. The outlaw becomes polished, the criminal becomes aestheticized, the real risks of poverty, state violence, and systematic inequality are airbrushed out. This is the danger of Romanticism when unmoved from the material history. It can elevate, but it can also obscure. In the end, Jack Sheppard is not just a character, he is a mirror. He reflects a society uneasy with its own mechanisms of control, a state that needs prisons but fears the stories they produce, a public that mourns the condemned but craves order, a literary tradition that loves rebels but prefers them dead, distant, or fictional. Romanticism allowed the figure of the outlaw to survive in memory, but only by converting rebellion into beauty, and the state, for all its power, found itself haunted by the very myths it helped to create. Jack Sheppard escaped prison, but he could not escape a narrative. So we must ask, when rebellion becomes entertainment, when dissent becomes a costume, when the outlaw becomes a legend, do we preserve resistance or do we bury it beautifully? Until next time, remember, every crime story is also a story about civilization, and sometimes what we mythologize reveals more about our fears than the truths. This has been Crime and Civilization. Thank you for watching.